This is Game Dev Unchained, the #1 game development podcast about game development and the lifestyle thereof. I am your host, Brandon Pham, and today I have a special guest that is joining me, Joschka Pottgen. How you doing, Joschka?
Hey, nice to meet you. I'm doing good. How are you?
A little better than I am, right? A little rough start. This is our third try, but I assure you it's going to be a fun part of our interview here where this is an opportunity for you, which is usually our guests introduce themselves to our audience out there, who they are, where you're at, and where you're heading.
All right. So my name is Joschka Pottgen, as you already said. I started working at Tarsier Studios, a game company, 2 years ago, a little bit more than 2 years ago. And I'm currently there, the lead of the core tech team. Before that, I did something completely different. Namely, I worked at the European Lab for Particle Physics called CERN. Where I made my PhD and worked on research on particle physics.
When you're talking about particle physics, for the layman's out there, are you talking about computer simulation in particular, or what exactly is that applied to?
No, it had nothing to do with computers. I mean, of course, there's computer simulation involved in particle physics, but it is the fundamental research on the particles that make up all the matter that surrounds us, right? It's basically what CERN does is it collides protons and does that at pretty high energies. And we look at whatever happens when we collide them and what kind of particles are created in those processes and try to find new things. Like, for example, the Higgs boson, which was discovered a couple of years ago, which maybe some people have heard of if they're interested in this kind of research.
All right, now you're going to have to bridge the gap. So how did you go from there to game development? So what happened here? So I'm at least guessing that you were interested in games and then something happened.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I was. So, I mean, I played games all my life, pretty much. I'm also a very, very enthusiastic D&D player and dungeon master. So there's a little bit of game design, I guess, in there, and narrative design. But apart from that, I basically, all I did there was programming and working on build systems and setting up automation for different things, working on monitoring. And all of that, of course, has a big role in computer game development. And I started at Tarsier because they had a job opening which pretty much looked for exactly what I was doing, which was a DevOps position. So I started there as a kind of build engineer / DevOps and worked on their build system and automation processes. And that's pretty much how I got into it. And it's a very interesting ride so far. It's very different from CERN, but it also has a lot of parallels.
What are the main parallels? Because I'm still wrapping my head about you dealing with real science, and then I mean, computer engineering, is that part of what you guys have to learn? Or I mean, that's a whole different side of it, right? As far as
but it is very different. I mean, so it's something that has been becoming more and more important over the years in particle physics, especially because you have to see a lot of what we do at CERN involves a lot of simulation, computer simulation,
right?
And then comparing that simulation with data that we take with big machines, essentially. And so a lot of software development is involved, and especially automation is very important, and making sure that things run very quickly. So there's also a lot of optimization, which I guess also has some parallels to what we do in game development, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely. I mean, game development as industry itself is very technical. I think more technical than most industries, at least because we're dealing with real-time simulation. So things have to run and look good at this state, right? So I would say when I talk to developers or anybody that's outside or coming in, they find it the most stimulating, because we have a lot of game developers, especially engineers, that go out and go to other tech companies that are a lot more profitable. But like, they definitely lack the passionate drive that our technology within the industry is constantly striving for. And that's one of the things I feel like we keep a lot of engineers because of that sole reason. Do you find that to be somewhat true?
For sure, but that's actually one of the big parallels.
Yeah,
because at CERN, because of the size of it, I mean, I don't know how much you know about CERN. It's a pretty big lab with like 3,000 people working on site. And there's a huge IT department. We have a huge computing farm, or they have a huge computing farm. And they work with industry leading experts from Intel, from Google, et cetera, to make things run as quick as possible and basically operate at the very edge of that kind of technology. Mm-hmm. And that's what I see as the parallel to games development. Like, there's a lot of that as well. And I kind of, that's what I took from CERN and that I loved at CERN. And now have again at Tarsier, because there is, or in games development in general, because there is exactly this drive to develop technology and bring it to a stage where it hasn't been before, and kind of be on the bleeding edge and make it better. And yeah, I completely agree with you that that's like one of the big factors why it's interesting. And what especially comes into play for game development compared to how it was in my previous job is that there is this collaboration with very different disciplines, right? Where before it was mostly engineers and physicists. Here I work with artists and designers and guys who do narrative design or audio guys, right? And that brings a whole new aspect to the whole game, which to me is one of the big factors that makes it very, very interesting.
So you're speaking on two different fronts of bleeding edge. One is with scientists and physics that feels important. and then games is like essentially as entertainment, but I do see like a return with the real-time simulation that we are providing. Other verticals are starting to finally take notice and utilize within their tech industry to kind of push their industries forward outside of just games and entertainment. Now being a part of game development, how do you see that future kind of playing out, where it's going to be beyond just games and entertainment? I don't know how familiar you are with this, but do you see the applications starting to extend beyond just controllers and game consoles?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's already a lot of that actually happening. And in scientific computing, parallel computing is very, very important. And for that, of course, the games industry with graphics cards has brought in a lot of new technology, which is being adapted slowly in science as well. So I've seen that happening while I worked at CERN, that there was basically a whole new algorithm development, or a new branch of algorithm development happening, making sure that we use those resources that basically were introduced because the games industry pushed technology forward. Mm-hmm. And I think the same applies to other industries for sure.
Mm-hmm. So you've been 2 years and you're saying this is your first game development job.
Yes,
on paper.
That is very true.
How has your experience been? I mean, how hard was the transition? Did you feel like it was tougher than it was, or easier than it was, or were you just thrilled by the sheer fact that you were working on a passion project?
It was kind of easier than I thought, because a lot of what I was doing especially in the beginning when I started at Tarsier, was really working on only the backend system side. So working on the build systems and integrating tools and things that are very similar to what I did before. Now that I get a little bit more involved as the lead of our core tech team, where it's more towards the actual game systems and that kind of implementations, it's becoming more challenging, and I have to learn much more things very quickly.
Mm-hmm. So how has the dynamic been? I mean, at CERN, were you managing teams back then too, or was this a new skill set that was kind of thrust on you?
I wasn't on paper. I wasn't really managing anything. I was in a position, however, where I was supervising other PhD students, and I was working with a few different teams that were sitting in different parts of Europe and coordinating a little bit between them. Like, there was an actual software coordinator that worked above me, but that person didn't have that much time, so a lot of the day-to-day business of that fell onto me. So some of those things I definitely brought also already into the job, but it's again kind of a different level, because now the full responsibility is on me, and like the actual personal responsibility for the people that work in that group, which I didn't have before, because it was people that were employed by other people. But now it's actually all on me. So that's definitely something that I'm learning as we go.
So aside from the adjustment to the different industry, adjustment to people is obviously a key factor, right? So you dealing with scientists and physicists before, and now dealing with artists. I mean, engineers are sort of on that level of thinking, but like now you're artists and designers. So like, how has that dynamic been?
It's been amazing. I really like it. It's before at CERN, it's a lot of people who think kind of alike that come to a table. So there's still very, very vivid discussions, but everybody kind of has a very similar mindset, right? While here in the games industry, that is definitely not sure, because problems are approached from many more angles than what I'm used to. And I really love that fact. It's amazing to see how, sometimes I struggle with grasping what other people tell me, and the other way around. And then you have to come up with more explanations or different explanations of what you're talking about, and make sure that everybody at the end of the day comes to the same page and everybody understands each other. So I really, it's an interesting experience and a learning curve for sure.
Mm-hmm. I'm always interested too on the outsider's perspective, because I've been in the game industry for a while now, so I'm very very keen on how we look at ourselves. But coming from that other industry, and especially talking to your colleagues, like, hey, I'm thinking of switching industries to games. I mean, I wonder what type of feedback did you get, or thinking on, at least on that side of like, is that even a possibility? I know there's more respect now in terms of just game developers, but it's not like quite there yet in terms of a viable option for a lot of scientists, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very mixed reaction, I think. There were a few people who are more my age, I guess, or our age, that were kind of impressed or were intrigued, at least, by the whole idea that I would go into games development and try that thing that they always thought, oh my God, it would be really interesting to work there, but I don't have the skill set for that. But then there were definitely some more senior people that were a little bit more critical. And I remember one person said to me, yeah, okay, so you're going into games industry, entertainment. Other people do brain cancer research after they work here. Which, not condescending at all. Mm-hmm. But I think overall it was a very positive experience, that people were kind of more intrigued than anything else, and very supportive as well. Mm-hmm. Well, and again, like as you mentioned yourself, like the influence from games industry and driving technology forward. There were also a few who mentioned that, like one person brought up, if you meet some very smart people who work on these algorithms, make sure that they know that there's also a job here maybe for them if they want. So I think there's also a lot of people who are keen on kind of that cross-fertilization that is happening.
Yeah, and I think that's still like a blossoming side of the industry that not a lot of people are aware of. Like these tech companies are starting to use game tech essentially to a lot of these self-driving cars, for example, they're using crowd simulation within the engine itself to kind of help get their tech to be smarter until they actually test it out. Surgeons going to these like simulations, police officers, the army, they're all using game tech to kind of create a better virtual environment using VR goggles. So I'm always interested to kind of hear like how, because these are just small little nerd circles within the companies of these tech, right? That they, oh yeah, these are innovative ways that we can think about this, but it hasn't really broadened to this landscape where people at CERN are aware of this huge industry potential, because games have gotten and pretty far since, the 80s.
That's true for sure. No, I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are not aware, because they are trying to do some collaboration at least. For example, there was, when I left, I don't know actually where it was taken, but there was this idea of doing a virtual tour of CERN in virtual reality. I have to be honest, and I haven't really kept up to date with that project, but it sounded interesting back then. And there was also another project that I thought was really amazing, where they were trying to bring augmented reality to basically their to the computing centers. If there's a faulty unit, to very quickly identify where it is and get hints, basically a heads-up display. Implementing things like that are things that CERN is looking into, at least, or was looking into when I was there.
Yeah. And that's like part of the game industry that I'm very excited about. Making games and entertainment is super fun, but I think there are a lot of practical needs that other industries can benefit from us. And like you said, yeah, the AR tech at its core is a game engine to make that heads-up display work. So my other question to you is, since being at Tarsier Studios, I think you guys announced your second game, right? And I can only guess that that's the game that you guys are working on. Don't need to divulge any details about that, but was there a particular reason why you chose Tarsier Studios over any other choices?
Location. Because my wife actually moved to Sweden, so that was a very, very big factor in choosing Tarsier over, let's say, any other random game studio. And that I ended up at a game studio other than a different industry was also kind of chance. But as I said before, it's like driven by the interest in games development in general. I had my little like hobby projects when I was not yet working at a games company. Now that kind of stopped, where I did my little game prototypes and things that never got anywhere, of course. But yeah, that's why I looked into different game studios in Malmö. And then I looked at the Tarsier website, and I remember reading that job description, and I was just, yeah, that's true. That's me. And I decided to apply. And I guess they agreed that I would be a very good fit for this kind of position.
That's great. I mean, I'm always in support of that. Oh, my video just went cracked, so I'm just going to switch to you. I'm always in support of like outside influence from other industries to kind of help the industry grow. I mean, that's the only way that I've seen the industry have grown to the state it is, to continuously look at outside perspective and bring it in to our business. Even though it is for entertainment, I think there's a lot of technology being driven right now that are really great case scenarios for everybody. There's a lot of like championing the game industry and the game dev profession, as you can probably guess from what I'm trying to say. But like, I also want to see your perspective overall on how, I know you came in more like a fan of the industry, but now being a game developer, like I wonder like what your perspective is in terms of like the industry as a whole and the state of where it is and where you feel like we can grow both positively and negatively, and everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad question.
Yeah.
So I think about the state of the industry, it's hard to judge for me as well, because I haven't been there so long, right? So I don't want to lean too far out the window. But like one of the things that I see happening that is not being done as much as it could be, at least in our studio, is making sure that we don't reinvent the wheel all the time. And with that, I mean, basically, when we create our games, keep in mind that it's not just for the product that we're currently working on, but could also be something for the product that we do next. And I see that also in some other studios I've talked with, or talks I've seen, that people are moving towards that, but they still can learn a lot, I think, from other industries when it comes to that. And yeah, I think that's one of the main things that I'm at least concentrating on at Tarsier at the moment, making sure that we do that. And I mean, for us, a big thing is, of course, we as you just mentioned, we released Little Nightmares 1 pretty much just before I came, and that was the first game that we made with Unreal Engine. Since then, or basically in the same week as Little Nightmares, we actually released the second game with Unreal Engine, which is called Static, which is a pretty small VR game for PSVR. And from that, we have learned to take things the next step and make sure that we can use them for the next projects. And that's what I'm working on, pretty much, making that work as well as possible.
And that's one of the topics actually we are discussing for our upcoming GDUX. But like I kind of want to dive into it a bit, like especially with smaller studios. Bigger studios actually I feel have a better handle of this, where they reuse technology and build off of that, where smaller studios kind of concentrate on just getting one game at a time out, and often would just press the restart button, which is if we try to really make sense of it, makes no sense at all, right? If we're trying to utilize a small team and its resources to its best of its ability. So what do you factor that to be mostly? Is it just misplanning, or is this one of those things where a team just feels like they want to innovate, and with innovation just has to just go back to the drawing board from scratch?
I think a big factor is what you just said, that it's kind of small teams, and because it's small teams, the deadlines can become pretty tight. So it's almost a luxury to think about these things, right? Because what you have to focus on is to hit your milestones and make sure that you get the stuff done that needs to be done to release the game in the end. And while I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, it's like taking it the next step between projects, basically, is one of the things that we need to get better at. And as you said, like bigger studios are definitely better at that, and they need to be better at that because they spend much more money on the games. But yeah, it's a very important topic for small studios as well. And I'm also wondering if things like open source could be something that is that could play a bigger role in this than it currently does. Because while you never want to open source the entire game, I think there's definitely some merit in opening up systems that are reusable, like going a similar direction as Epic does with Unreal Engine, while working on smaller systems and basically leveraging more of Unreal Engine and make sure that we share that across smaller studios.
Mm-hmm. I feel like our industry is a lot more tight-lipped than other industries, where at least with movies, yes, they protect their IPs, but even when it comes to its success and box office numbers day one, they are a lot more vocal and transparent. Mainly because they can't really hide those things because they rely on the theaters kind of drawing their numbers. But it's something where games, unless the private companies want to reveal it, we have a harder time to kind of gauge which games are doing well or not, which also makes it hard for us to kind of pitch our game within a genre that is obscure. And that's the more broader view of that. But on a smaller scale, well, kind of big scale, open source IP, like having technologies where smaller teams, especially, I feel like indie developers are probably more open to this idea of like sharing technology within each other and sharing ideas and best practices to kind of help everyone succeed because we're less competitive. It's an interesting proposal. Is this something that you just observed just from the last 2 years? Because it sounds pretty obvious, but it isn't something that a lot of people are pushing right now, which I feel is at a disadvantage to all the smaller time developers trying to create and invent new things on the daily and not learning from each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've definitely observed in the last 2 years, but I've always wondered because coming from physics, or especially CERN has a very long history of being very open about basically everything they do. All the source code for all the simulation and everything is open source. You can access the data that is taken by the experiments and basically on to some extent at least redo the analyses that are being published. So it's for me, it's a very natural thing to think about, okay, how can we kind of make sure that more people benefit from the stuff that we do? And I mean, I also don't want to sound completely naive. I mean, I'm aware that if you do that too much, you might hurt your own business from it, right? But I feel like things like, for example, a build system, a working build system for Unreal Engine, that can package for different platforms and is flexible enough to adapt to different scale projects, basically, and distributes binaries within the studio and that sort of stuff. That's not something that we make our money with, essentially, right? That's something we can easily share and provide smaller studios with and simplify basically their workflows. So, yeah, I agree with you. It's something that should be kind of straightforward, and I wonder why it's not happening more.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely headways made by software companies like Unreal, Unity, making their engines free for anyone to use. Yes. Blender, in terms of 3D software, has really pushed forward the last couple of years because they've been open source and free. And I feel personally that they're kind of really dominating over 3D Max and Maya, the traditional programs that we use within a game studio. Those guys have been just so lazy on their laurels. We're not sponsored by Autodesk, but I have to say the last 5-6 years, they just haven't been updating and innovating. And Blender has been taking a lot of market share. And I feel in the next couple of years, because of them being open source and so openly available and so innovative, that they're going to take over that market really soon, if not already.
I actually had a lunch conversation today about exactly that.
Yeah,
where one of our artists is basically saying the same thing. Like, why are we paying and not using Blender instead? Because Blender has made so much headway and basically has innovated where Maya has been stale for the last years, and it would make so much more sense for him to move towards Blender. So I agree. I mean, there's a lot of headway being made in that, and there's definitely companies who do a lot of this, but it is still only a few, right? It's basically engine providers, and then a few like Blender. I don't know if there's more.
No, I mean, that's the only ones that I can really think of right now.
Yeah.
But those are proven case scenarios that within our industry have shown how much improvement to everybody's well-being, and should be used as an example for developers and studios to be more open about this type of stuff, especially with the indie crowd. The indie crowd, and this is something I kind of want to have a more open discussion with you to kind of hear your opinion about that. You know, streaming is, of course, it's coming, right? I think it's going to start with really in real discussion with Stadia. I don't think it's going to change anything because at least in the States we have data caps. So it's kind of limiting to how much we can stream, which is hopefully they can reverse that law. But it's not to kind of downplay how the console guys have been doing streaming for years now, just been probably just quietly being successful with that model. I wonder what your thoughts about how streaming comes into play with smaller developers and the industry as a whole, because it will make an impact. We're just not sure how big of an impact it will be. Yeah,
it's an interesting question. I think especially, like as you said, with Stadia, there's a lot of things that can happen. If you look at what they are basically marketing with, where you can jump into a game with your favorite YouTube personality and compete against them or play with them or whatever, somehow integrate all that directly into the game. I think there is a lot of potential to completely change how we play games and consume games, right? Because there's so many people who tell me that they have watched a Let's Play of something, but have never played the game themselves. And if you shorten that gap somehow, I think there's a lot of potential for sure.
Yeah, that is something pretty interesting as well. The latest trend with streamings and streaming stars have been that, yes, people... The product isn't about the games anymore. They just tune into their streamers, and that's the product, right? And
yes.
Unless there's a community around the game itself, which you guys probably understand with Little Nightmares, you guys build a community. People don't buy into the game. They want to buy into a community that continues way after the game, and be a part of that community in the long term. And I am the one thing with Google... and I joke about this all the time. They call it Stadia, and I feel ironically if they're gonna stay, right? Because with Google products, as you can understand, right, they make things as much as they quit on them. It feels like Stadia is gonna last a little longer than one of their pet projects because of the potential that they understand. But it's a hard business to get into. And their leverage with YouTube and being one click away from actually playing the game is very enticing. And I hope that does solve what you're saying, an issue where maybe it's more about access and less about their interest of actually playing the game. Because that is a barrier I feel like the last few years have been building up. And developers or small-time developers are having a hard time kind of just how do we convert these guys, if any, into paying customers or even playing customers,
Yeah. No, I completely agree. The communities that we build with the games that we make, they keep it alive, and it's important that we have them. But at the same time, if those communities then can also help us reach more people to actually play the games that we make, that is a huge thing and would be a big factor in helping us make better games and bringing it to more people, for sure.
Plus, I would love to see... The impact of the Switch is very clear, right? People playing AAA console games on the go felt like an obvious thing, but it took a while for the technology to catch up for us to actually achieve that. But now that with the streaming stuff, it gives us a really insane amount of access through our phones and tablets, playing the games that I would normally only play on my console. How do you feel that will change people's perspective once it's a lot easier? The buy-in is a lot smaller. Like if you feel like people who are not within our age at CERN, do you feel like that removes a certain barrier for them to actually get into games because now they don't have to buy into a $500 computer or console?
I'm not sure with the people that I had in mind when I said that. I think that's not the specific problem that they had. But I think in general, for sure. And I mean, you see that with the mobile market, right? There's so many people who play on their mobile phones that would never have bought a PS4. And if then through Stadia in some way you make the non-mobile games accessible for them as well, I think that will be a very big thing. While I mean, the people at CERN who were saying what they were saying, it was really just people who grew up with a very different environment.
Mm-hmm. Trying to solve world issues. And less about,
or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, it's still like although we have Fortnite, although I feel like in recent years game development is a little bit less obscure, right? The mainstream have really taken notice and respected in a certain way. There's still like a lot of old school thoughts about how games are just a toy, which I don't think will ever be removed, but it's getting there. It's getting there, I feel, in a lot of times.
No, I completely agree about that as well. And like, I mean, I also don't want to say that the scientists at CERN look at games condescendingly in any way. Like that was one opinion, right? I don't want to give the wrong impression here. Because, for example, we also said at some point in the meeting and talked about making CERN more accessible, and there were ideas of building the detectors that we have for kids in Minecraft so that they can explore them. So, I mean, it's definitely there that people who are not gamers themselves perceive this as a big opportunity to reach more people and engage with them in a very different way than they were able to do before. So it's a huge. It has a lot of potential to improve a lot of things, and especially with virtual reality. If I think about that as a having my physicist hat on, if I think about stuff like cosmology, sorry. Mm-hmm. Difficult word for me for some reason. If I think about cosmology or stuff like that, and you implement some sort of virtual reality where you can explore the cosmos, I mean, that's just mind blowing. Like if I had that as a kid, I would have been just blown away.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're kind of broadening into a topic that I always joke about, right? How we're all this VR and AR talk is kind of leading us to the Matrix, and the running joke is it's going to be powered by Unreal or powered by Unity, basically, right? So as a real life scientist, a physicist, like how do you, if we just play into the sci-fi world a bit, how do you see games kind of lending into that? It seems like there's a natural progression there towards that type of reality where people kind of live within a virtual world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can think of a lot of ways how that can make it easier to reach more people. Like one way, as I said before, like where you have simulations and visuals that make it clearer to the person you're talking to what you're actually talking about. But then there's also when you think about education, if not every school can afford to have a science lab, right? With virtual reality, suddenly that may be much more easy to acquire because all you need to do is buy some product and a few VR goggles, and people can explore that sort of stuff through simulation. And I think that's a huge thing that will hopefully be adapted by a lot of schools to make it easier for people to get into science as well.
Mm. What are the main restrictions that you feel when it comes to education, right? Game development itself have been, at least in the States, like the schools have been closing down left and right because they were mostly for profit. It only is recently with universities that game development and even pro gamers programs have kind of been popping up left and right. Is there any insight on at least that side of the world in terms of like education? Because you're obviously, at least with game development, pretty much self-taught.
Yes, absolutely.
So what is the landscape over there in terms of just somebody who wants to get into this?
And you mean games development specifically, I assume, right?
Yeah, game development specifically. Well, you can tell our audience about how to be a scientist, but it seems a little tougher for most people.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. For games development, we actually in Sweden have a pretty big school called the Games Assembly that is specifically designed to teach game design, game programming, etc., to students who are interested in that. And it's a very compact program of, I think, 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong, because but I think it is a 2-year program where they get basically a crash course in how we develop games and how to get a job in the industry. And we actually at Tarsier have a lot of people who graduated from that school, and they come with a lot of knowledge about how game development works and integrate very, very quickly into our teams. So at least in Sweden, that is something that's happening quite a bit. In Germany, where I'm from, I'm actually not so sure. I think there is a couple of universities that offer specific programs, but it is nothing like here where you have a specific school that teaches that, as far as I know. But I might be wrong.
Well, I have to assume that you went to to a college to get your degree to work at CERN.
Yeah,
right?
I did.
It's not. Yeah, it's not one of those jobs that you can just walk in and be bright, right? They do require some basic educations and certificates. Yeah. So going through that and then transitioning to more of a self-taught, well, for any future learning, right? It seems like you're a pretty bright guy who continues to learn and grow. And like, is there any? Try it. Is there any like tips that you have out there for developers or anybody that's listening? Like, how do you continuously be so motivated? Because I assume, and I only feel like you have a lot of hobbies on the side as well besides all this.
I do. I have too many hobbies, I think. I don't know. How does that work? I have no clue. It's just, I think it's something that comes natural to me, that I'm just very motivated to try and acquire more knowledge. And I just use any channel that I find to do that. And yeah, it's, I think a lot of it is organization and being sure to make the time for the things that you want to do. For example, on the weekends, I used to, scroll up and down my Steam library, not being sure what I want to play, but thinking I should play something. And then I just made sure that if I'm in that kind of mind space where I'm not even sure what I really want to do, I just do something else then. And keep monitoring myself and try to be productive, even in the times where I maybe don't initially feel like I want to be productive. Mm-hmm. But of course, that's also not something that always works. I've spent the idle Sunday staring at my computer screen and not doing anything. Mm-hmm. Well, not even playing the game that I wanted to play.
That's a necessary balance. But it sounds like also,
Exactly.
was this passed on or taught? Like, so I have children, right? So I'm
Mhm.
the key thing that I was wanting to pass on to them is just to be naturally curious.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
sounds like, is this something that you picked up from your parents, just being curious and wanting to learn and always being productive? Where does this discipline come from?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's my parents made me go outside a lot and explore the woods and stuff like that. I think that's a very important part to, as a kid, get naturally curious about things in the world, and then that developed more into into all these kinds of different hobbies. Like I because of D&D, for example, I picked up crafting recently and doing a lot of dungeon building and things like that. And I
Mm.
think a lot of skills that I learned as a kid because my parents made me go to an art school to learn drawing and painting and sculpting. That all now suddenly pays off because, hey, this is super useful for this hobby I'm picking up right now. So yeah, it's I think a lot of it comes from my parents who made me do things that maybe I wasn't motivated for at the time. And I'm very thankful for that, for sure.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to trying to do, right? But like what I found with a lot of successful people is that they have parents, or at least at a young age, were enabled to kind of explore as many things as they can and make it possible for them to go ahead and pursue that passion. Is one of those things too that I'm trying to like instill in my children. Like, whatever you start, just finish it to an
Mm,
optimal level. Just be good at it, and then if you decide if you don't want to move forward, that's fine. But at least you obtain that
yeah.
skill. And I feel a lot of children nowadays, at least in the States, they have a natural curiosity at first and interest, but then they never finish through with it, and which is a detrimental outcome, I feel. Um, but I'm always
Yeah.
curious in other countries, such as Germany or anywhere in Europe, um,
Mm,
how children are naturally, what's normal over there, because it feels like accessibility and are more encouraged than it is here. It feels more restricted here. I feel like there's like a standard status quo that people are expected, at least in the States. It's like, just go to school, do your required electives, because at least on over here they're taking music out, they're taking all the electives out. There's not a lot of
yeah.
other things besides math and science, which I feel like you are thumbs up on. But as an artist, it's very hard to find my place within school. I mean, what type of structure do you feel over there is a little bit more advantageous than we are in the States? At least what you felt was helpful for you in your upbringing.
Yeah. So when like the art school that I mentioned, I think, and I might be wrong because this is a long time ago, but I think it was at least subsidized by the state, right?
Oh,
So there's a lot of that where the because we have welfare states over here, they try to help bring these things into families by subsidizing a lot of this stuff, which is of course a huge opportunity because even when your parents aren't super rich or anything, they can afford to bring you to those schools and make sure that you learn whatever you think or what your parents think you should learn. And I mean, also, like, I also picked up stuff that I really was bad at. Like, I tried to learn the bass guitar and I just couldn't wrap my head around it. So, but still, I had the opportunity to try it, and as you said, at least take it to a level where I could say, no, this is not for me,
mm-hmm.
even though I would like it to be for me. But yeah, I think it's basically accessibility to these kinds of things and structures. Having them around is very important. And what you say is also something that I observe over here. It's and that's more going into university actually, where since we moved away from, or we standardized kind of our university credits and modeled them a little bit after, I think, the Anglo-Saxon system, sort of. I don't know. But for because of that restructure, it also went more towards a very straight path that you have to take. While when I studied many years ago now, it was more encouraged to stray from your path and take any courses that you think might be interesting, right? So even though you might be studying physics, you might as well take a course in philosophy or take a course in, I don't know, anything else, literature or whatever you can think of. So it's sad to see that in Germany as well, this is a direction it's developing towards.
Yeah, and it's something within the States that I've noticed we've been doing for a long time. I mean, it's because for a long time, taking out electives or like any type of different perspective of thinking, pretty much creating cogs to be very good at one particular thing is becoming an issue, since automation, as you may be aware, is a huge problem that's happening very soon, where robotics are kind of replacing jobs that can be done by robots, right? So what I'm seeing is like a lot of people are not able to. So I'm only saying this to you because you have a dual career, essentially, which is a very unique stand to have efficiency in both different industries, right? And it's over here in the States, there's just people who are trying to find a single career, and they're just having troubles adapting to the new changes of the technology and robotics being a part of it. So I'm always curious about a global perspective on that, and what ways, at least how you think is can be avoidable. That's why when I talk about games, and when you were talking about education and people putting on VR and having more accessibility with the internet, enabling a lot of that, I feel can help a lot of this issue. Like just someone being able to learn guitar with someone like a master across the world it's very exciting stuff that I don't think a lot of people really think of games as that type of potential. Not to downplay entertainment, which is fun, but
no, exactly.
There's bigger applications that I feel like a physicist such as yourself can definitely appreciate. It's just so funny to me, man. I'm sure you hear a lot of slack, but like, I always admire like people are doing like very admirable things about the world and changing things, and it's like, oh, now you're working in games, okay. Which I think, there is a huge upside, but the bigger potential is a little later, like the Matrix and other things that not a lot of people think about how games can really apply to their lives.
Well, but I mean, I also don't really agree with that, though. Like games can have a big impact on people's lives and a positive impact on people's life, right? It's an art form that can challenge people and that can make them think about things that they wouldn't think about otherwise. It's the same as reading a good book or watching a movie that makes you think about something, just that the engagement with it is likely even deeper than it is, at least with a movie for sure, because you are in the space and you do things in the world, and because you do those things, your actions have consequences, and with that you can of course bring a lot of bring a lot of things to people's attention that you might not be able to do otherwise. So it's to me, it's a very important medium, and it's not just just entertainment.
Right.
It's
a fact. So I definitely agree with you there, because a lot of the tech companies, like the gurus that created Facebook and Twitter and all those, they got into programming mostly because of them trying to make a game of their own. Like their first projects are usually game related and not making a word processor or something. It's just naturally, you know what I mean? Making games is a little bit more fun than that type of application.
Yes, for sure.
So this is actually the end of the hour where we did an hour of podcasting. Thank you, Joschka, for joining us. And I told you it's going to fly by pretty fast. And it's also the time where I kind of hand the mic over to you to promote, to give attention to, or shout out to anybody that you want to use this little moment for.
Oh dear.
Oh deir. So I'm going to shut up and hand over the mic to you. Go for it.
All right. Thanks for having me. It was a blast talking to you. And I'd like to thank Merv to start with, because he set me up for this podcast together with you after he was here a couple of weeks ago, I think. Big thanks to my wife as well, who keeps supporting me with my crazy ideas like, hey, let's do games development. Maybe.
Well, we thank your wife too, man. We need people like you to kind of push the industry forward. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you. And look out for anybody listening. Joschka will be a speaker at gdux.me that I will be following you up on. And I look forward to your talk, man. So that pretty much ends this hour with Game Dev Unchained. We're here every Tuesday. And see you guys next week.